I relate a lot to what you said about the like the malformation, I think is the
sure.
word you used, right? In my evangelical days, I had a heavy diet of, exegesis one verse at a time,
Yeah.
just enough historical context to make the sermon interesting, right, or the book readable and interesting and incredible. But none of the depth of where did this all come from? Where did our ideas of what Scripture should mean come from? Where did the spiritual, the spiritual legacies of the church come from? And this was even in a time, there was a lot of churches around us starting to read like Richard Foster and Dallas Willard and reintroduce Lectio Divina and contemplative prayer and all these things that were so beneficial, but as if they came out in, the 1970s when Richard Foster wrote about them and not thousands of years earlier. That was my own discovery. I remember taking a church history class, and that was what for me confronted, like you said, the arrogance of we know better because we're newer, right? I realized, with some of the early church fathers, and even some of the ones that might have a stained reputation, like Origen, writing so many books and just being so prolific and so intelligent, that there's no part of the people in our age that are necessarily smarter than before. You look at the fathers, there's so many that are brilliant that I could never hold a candle to. Like even Augustine, you read Augustine, it's like, wow, what a mind, or St. Thomas Aquinas for sure. He's the heavy hitter. If you can read the Summa, then that's tough stuff. So that was a big part of it. And then realizing there's this whole beautiful narrative in church history. And even in my church history class, we just kind of brushed over it. And I had a good professor who we were all Reformed, many of us Calvinist type of kids in that class. And he did a good thing in that he wanted to challenge us a little bit with that. So he would present someone from the early church, like Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, maybe slightly too universalist for someone that's very Reformed. And he would present him in a really good light. And then he would get to John Calvin and show you all of his blemishes, which was really fair. But I still regret that we didn't go into the actual sources of the fathers. We read like their bios and maybe a couple quotes and learned a little bit about their lives. But that sparked a curiosity of like, well, I want to know about those people. Those were the people that inherited whatever it was that the apostles left. And then you read it and come to find out. So I felt the same way of, and there was almost sort of to be truthful, a resentment of like, well, why haven't we talked about this? Why haven't I read these letters before? Why didn't I even know that, St. Irenaeus was writing so early about things that are so seemingly Catholic, But yeah, there was a lot that shifted. And one of them was, what you mentioned in that the historical critical method or bust type of approach, realizing how the fathers read the Bible and do theology is very similar to a rabbinic context. Yeah. And so for them, that was on the table. Whereas for us, we were taught, well, that's just intellectually not that rigorous or great. And it's too mythological or too over-spiritualizing, the analogous readings of Scripture. Things like that aren't as good as hard exegesis, But realizing that much of the doctrines that we believed came from that sort of, typology-rooted, multi-layered approach to Scripture. That was a huge foundational shift. And then it's one, I think once you go through it, you can't even look at the Scriptures the same way. And then if you're having a conversation with someone that's had not had that paradigm shift, you're like, oh no, it's kind of tough to only get back into a narrow frame of mind. And exegesis is beautiful, but yeah, there's something about that richness. And it's not strictly, how do I want to say this? It's not the academic sort of approach that we've been trained to take in our culture, right? You're approaching the Bible as a narrative, not for the sake of it not having happened, but for the sake of that's how the authors and that's how God himself has communicated it to our humanity in a way, right? And that makes it so much deeper and almost more true, even if it literally is true and like the historical things and all of that, it's almost more true since it speaks to that deeper sense as well. And the fact that it can do that so consistently and beautifully is not to be ignored. But I think that's something I realized in my formation. There was a dryness to not having that once you have it, it just feels like this waterfall of so much to chew on. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? The sola scriptura. Maybe this is a principle for the whole of the way we should try and think. If you try to take something and make it not so much just a focus point, but the only thing, like Scripture alone. As you said, what happened was, in a way, it shrunk because it didn't have apostolic tradition to go to say, well, how's tradition read the Scriptures?
Right.
So, and as soon as that happened, I remember Origen he says in one of his places, this Scripture just has so many meanings. Where shall we begin?
Yeah.
That sense of, okay, I'm just beginning to move into this ocean.
Right.
And that was the way in which the fathers approached it, which Protestantism, which loves the Scriptures so much, in a way, is love for something is not the same thing as it's the exclusionary principle of Protestantism seems to be the problem. It's we've got this, therefore not that.
Right.
The kind of the both and approach of Catholicism is what saves every element of it.
Right.
Because the richness is supplied only in communication with the other elements of the faith. That seems to be it. Yeah. So discovering the fathers, discovering the unity of Scripture, the way the church has always seen it as one, and as the message of God with his one plan. I think I found after a while, and especially the more I moved into trying to understand what the church meant by how do you transmit the faith, that all of this is a kind of profound confidence in God. That's Catholicism is built upon the fact, well, in the first place, a very simple way of thinking, why does Catholicism accept tradition as well? It's just that it trusted Jesus and the Spirit in the way they formed the apostles. And the church trusts that Jesus' promises would be kept to maintain the faith. It's a kind of a very childlike trust in God's plan, it seems to me, is what Catholicism relies upon. That doesn't deny the human failings at every point in the church, or deny that we can go terribly wrong. And we know our own short-sightedness, but that God is able to handle our problems.
Yeah.
And
that was a big actually almost apologetic argument for me, is looking at the blemishes of church history and some of the worst figures in it, and saying, how is this place still around? How is this church still around? I mean, any other human institution certainly would have collapsed, but yeah, that is beautiful.
And it is based on, in a way, the apostles, the way the Gospels. I'm really impressed by the way the Scriptures are so happy to have its heroes with all the blemishes presented in a way that I think would be quite rare even now for, let's say, a political movement to try to have its at least its founding members. I know Christ founded the church, but at least the founding membership. So obviously obtuse. Ill-disciplined, backsliding, and needing to be rescued at every point. The Old Testament does set up God's plan like that very much. His pedagogy has to be one of mercy and overcoming problems over and over again. And, interestingly, again, and I don't know whether this is typical at all. This may be my lack of formation, but I came out of my Baptist phase knowing about the Exodus, but never about the exile. And when I first went to university and we were doing the exilic period, I was trying to understand this as the Exodus period. I had no sense of the narrative being, if you like, the entire collapse of both kingdoms. Everything God has founded is going to collapse.
Horribly wrong.
Horribly wrong. And the fruitfulness is going to come out of the moment of collapse. That's where the new... It's not that God will, like Noah's Ark, wash it away and start, he's kind of promised that's not the way the plan works. It's that God does kind of jujitsu on the situation. He uses the weakness to bring in grace, And I do think the church has embraced that principle by firstly making canonical all the Scriptures which were willing to present the apostles in such a bad light. So that as they themselves transmitted to the post-apostolic period, the picture they were giving was of themselves, very, very needy and constantly being misunderstood and misunderstanding and so on. And I think that's a powerful statement which enables one to look at the state of the church in any age, because I think we're so conscious of it now. But I mean, anybody conscious of church history isn't frightened of the church today at all.
Right. It's certainly been worse. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so it's, we've got our challenges today, but we've been there before in other ways.
Right.